You know, I believe very much in letter writing if you lost somebody.
Mm-hmm.
It is a therapy and a way of getting some kind of solace. You know, many bereaved parents think that maybe they don't want to, if they don't keep things, they will forget. So
Yeah.
I think letter writing is such a therapeutic way. And I wrote this very short letter to David, my son, who's killed. And I thought that would be a good way to start this conversation, because we're just going into Memorial Day, and I'm hoping we'll talk about that because it's so extraordinary what's planned for this year. And we're hoping that we'll get, last year we had 9,000 people came to the ceremony. And I think it was 20,000 people watched it on the web. But we're hoping to get like 40,000 people on the web at least.
Yeah, I think that's possible. We will talk a bit about it in the end, so that people know as well how they will be able to join the live stream.
I think that it's 8:30 here, which is 7:30 for you.
Yeah,
but we'll talk about that. So, David, my beloved, not a day goes by without your haunting smile that touches my very being. They all told me the day you died that it is terrible now, but you will learn to live with this pain next to you. In a way, that is true. But still, I guess the hole in my heart will never heal. I miss going with you to concerts, cooking and movies, and even listening to endless philosophical questions on Heidegger, etc. I miss you on the holidays when you invited friends who did not speak to their parents to endless meals. You said you would look after me when I grew old. Your mother was always a fixer, but this pain I cannot fix. I wonder what you would think of the course my life has taken since you were killed on that terrible day. I knew almost immediately that I wanted to do something to prevent other mothers, both Israeli and Palestinian, from suffering the same fate. Who would have imagined that I would stand up before thousands and thousands of people in a quest to stop the violence and to look for an end to this conflict, which has touched so many homes in both societies? I wanted to commemorate your name with something to do with education. And so I chose to join the Parents Circle, a group of Israeli and Palestinian bereaved families who choose a path of reconciliation rather than revenge. I have told your story to people all over the world, some very famous and some simple and loving. And I promise, even though you are no longer here, you still manage to inspire and to make a difference. I want to tell the world that there is a choice to be made after loss. That is, you can die with your loved one, or you can choose to try and prevent other families from suffering this pain, which never goes away. Deciding to write you letters is in a way, a continuation of motherhood, but it also allows me to speak to other mothers and to support them in finding a way to channel their pain. To quote you, lots of love, Ma. So I think that's very appropriate to begin our conversation. Very soon after David was killed, I knew that I would do something, but I didn't know about the Parents Circle then. And they asked me to come and talk at a demonstration in Tel Aviv to get out of the occupied territories. It was only 3 months after he was killed. And I did that. There was something like 60,000 people there. I don't know where I got that courage at that stage to do that. And some people from the Parents Circle heard me, and they also saw the articles in the newspaper. So they came to invite me to come to the Parents Circle. And the interesting thing is that they invited me to come to a weekend in East Jerusalem. And I said, no, I don't want to spend a weekend with other bereaved Palestinian and Israeli families. It's too much, enough pain on my own shoulders. But I actually didn't realize then how important it was for me to be with other bereaved parents, because those are the only ones that really understand.
Mm.
And this guy who started the Parents Circle was even more of a bulldozer than me, and that's quite difficult to find. And he convinced me And I went to this weekend, and looking into the eyes of Palestinian mothers, I realized that we shared the same pain, and that actually the tears were the same color, and that we could be such an effective catalyst if we stood on the stage together and said, stop the violence and let us look for another way. Because who is the least likely people to actually want to meet with each other and to look for another way? And so I started to travel all over the world, mainly with Palestinian partners. And I thought it was very important because I could speak English, which is ridiculous. I was born in South Africa. Any South African speaks English. And I spoke in Congress and in the House of Lords and all over the world in hip-hop concerts, wherever I was invited. And one night when I was home in Israel, there was another knock on my door. And it was the army. I mean, I opened the door and I saw 3 soldiers. And if you see 3 soldiers, only mean one thing. So I slammed the door in their face. And they kept knocking and knocking. And eventually I opened the door and they said, we came to tell you that we caught the man who killed David. And that was when it became very, very difficult. Because you see, you can talk about peace and love and reconciliation and read bad poetry and rainbows, but do you actually mean it? And so for me, this was the most difficult part of all of this work, was coming to this, to understand what I could do to still be in integrity with traveling and giving this message. Because now there's a face to the person who killed my child. It's no longer a mystery. And would I walk the talk that I always talk about? And it took me about 3 months, and I wrote a letter to the family of the sniper who killed David, and in which I told them who David was. He was a student at Tel Aviv University, and he was doing his master's in the philosophy of education. And he was part of the peace movement and the head of the student uprising. And so, you see, one doesn't really know who the person is behind the gun, because he was called to go to the reserves, as most Israelis do. And he didn't really want to go because it would have been the first time on his reserve duty that he would serve in the occupied territories. And he came to talk to me and he said, I don't know what to do. If I don't go, what will happen to my students? He was teaching young students philosophy, and they were going to be inducted into the army. And if I don't go, what happens to my soldiers? Because he was the officer. And if I do go, I will treat people with dignity, and so will all my soldiers. So you see, you don't know who that person was. Mm-hmm. And I told them that. And then I said also that we owed it to each other to meet, and to our grandchildren and children, because we can't go on killing each other. So 2 Palestinians from our group delivered the letter, and you can imagine they were very shocked, the family, to get this letter. And they said, if everybody signs on it, you know, maybe there can be peace. And I was expecting, because I'm not a very patient character, I was expecting to get a letter the next day in the mail from a sniper. Well, of course, it doesn't happen like that. Reconciliation is a process. It might never happen. And it took something like 3 years, and I got a letter back from the sniper. His name is Thaya. And he said that I'm crazy and that I should stay away from his family, and that he killed 10 people to free Palestine. But I knew from his parents that when he was a very small child, he saw his uncle violently killed by the Israeli army. And in the second Intifada, the uprising, he lost 2 uncles. And so he went on a path of revenge. And so after I wrote that letter, but the most wonderful thing that actually happened when I wrote the original letter was that I gave up being a victim. You see, being a victim, you can't move on with your life. It just holds you back. And if you give up being a victim, you become free. And that's good advice to anybody. They don't have to lose a child. Not to hang on and not to be anybody's victim, to clean stuff up. Doesn't mean you have to be friends. So today we work in schools a lot. A Palestinian and an Israeli go into an Israeli classroom, and it's probably the first time that these kids, age 17, have ever met a Palestinian, except, what they see on television. And they're very shocked because the personal narrative and storytelling is 90% of what we do in the parent circle. It's this sharing your stories to create empathy, even if you don't agree with each other. And today we had a Zoom with a school in Jerusalem, and some very radical right-wing people became very angry because they heard we were going to speak in the school, Palestinian Israeli, on a Zoom. And they started sending the students all kinds of terrible videos and accusations and things about the parent circle, which is absolute rubbish. But the school has been working with us for something like 10 years. So they insisted on going on. And there were 6 classrooms of 30, 35 kids. And what the teachers worked with the kids beforehand and said, if any of you, want to leave, you can leave, but you have to join the beginning of the talk. And actually 90% of the kids stayed. And so something like 180 Palestinian, Israeli kids for the first time heard a Palestinian narrative. It's quite extraordinary, and we are doing a lot of talks like I'm doing with you now, but also with Palestinian students and Israeli students. And the women's group, we have a women's group. When I first came to the parent circle, it was a pretty male-dominated organization. Of course, it wasn't going to be that for very long once I arrived on the scene, because I think women have to come to the table now. It's time. And there are extraordinary women who are started off, we had the grannies in the beginning, and now there's a young generation coming up who have gone through a course on reconciliation and are learning about each other and about each other's history. And even if they don't agree, there's this empathy which is created. We have a summer camp.
At least people are listening to each other's stories, even if they don't agree.
Yes,
people
even
are talking.
If we don't, you see, because it's a kind of history through the human eye. We have this narrative project, which is a parallel narrative. And we have something like 1,000 alumni from this project. And we take 15 Palestinians and 15 Israelis, normally from the same profession, because they have to do something after they go through this 3-month workshops with us and weekends. And we take them to sites that are meaningful, like Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, and to a village which existed before 1948 and is now part of Israel and is probably destroyed, And so this is a way of understanding the way the other person sees their history. And when you have that, it's the beginning of the end of conflict. I mean, there are endless projects which we do. And now what we want to do is to take the kids who are at the summer camp and let them cook. Everybody's stuck in their kitchens now, cooking. And we thought that the kids could film themselves cooking quarantine foods that they like and give us the recipe, and maybe we share it with everybody else. We don't know each other. There's such a cutoff since 2002. Virtually there are generations, new generations who've never met anybody, just like these kids I told you about in the schools. And by the way, we also go into the West Bank and work a lot with women in their houses. And these women have never met an Israeli who's not in uniform or isn't a settler. But why would they think I'm any different from that? So this is this question of beginning to know each other. In the parent circle, firstly, we are not affiliated to any political party. Of course, we're all political people, but we're not affiliated to political parties. We believe in a two-state solution. We believe even more so that Israel has to get out of the occupied territories for the good of Israel and for the Palestinians, because the occupation is killing the moral fiber of Israel, in my opinion. You cannot send people, you cannot occupy another people for so many years and imagine that it won't affect your moral being.
I took what you said is a great inspiration. What I would say is for reconciliation to happen, would you agree that we have to accept there's many histories and we need to understand the other's history? We may not have to accept it, but to understand their history so we can work together and recognize that we do have some issues that we can work with in bringing society together as one.
Well, I told you about this project that we do, this narrative project, which is called History Through the Human Eye. And that means that you will understand, part of this course is we have two professors, one Israeli and one Palestinian, who each talk about the milestones of our history, which would be like 1948, 1967, 73, the two Intifada uprising. How does each side see that? And of course, it's completely different from the way that the Israelis, if I look at 1948 for the Israelis, what is that? That's the creation of the State of Israel. But for the Palestinians, that's the Nakba, the catastrophe, when they lost their houses. So if I understand how you see your history, and Brian, it sounds like you have an bit of Irish turning.
I am Irish, yes, Robbie, I am Irish.
I thought so. So, you know, one of the problems is that there's never been a reconciliation process in Ireland. You've got a peace, which is great, I wish we had, but you don't have a reconciliation process. And I think that that is such an essential part of a lasting peace and not just a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
So why don't I tell you a very quick story? I like telling stories. Okay, it's not going to go on for hours.
A good storyteller, so go ahead.
So we have a wonderful woman in the organization. Her name is Bushra. And she's Palestinian and she lost her son. And I came to a meeting in Beit Umar, which is in the West Bank, where I'm not really allowed, but I don't care anyway. So it was with Palestinian women, and I was the only Israeli. And she came into the room and she saw, of course, she recognized that I wasn't a Palestinian and she didn't want to stay. And I went to ask her, you know, please stay. I want to know what happened to your son. And she sat more or less with her back to me like this. And I kept asking her, how old was he? What happened? What school was he at? And all the questions around this. And then I said, and she had a picture of Mahmoud, her son, around her neck.
Mm.
And I said, would you like to see a picture of David? So very reluctantly, she said yes. And then she turned towards me and she looked at the picture and she said, haram, which means what a pity.
Mm.
And so what happened after that, she is today perhaps the most important woman in the women's group, because she had an emotional breakthrough of recognizing that we share the same pain. And that's what happens when Israelis come to meet Palestinians and Palestinians meet Israelis on a storytelling basis. The minute she shared with me all of this, and she said in that meeting, if I ever meet the man who killed Mahmoud, after 100 years I would kill him. But today she's a completely different human being. She traveled with me all over the world. It's extraordinary to see a personal transformation and to be a part of it, and it's such a gift. It was, I really love her. And last year when it was Ramadan, so she brought all the kids and we all went shopping and bought them goodies for Ramadan, and now we can't even see each other.
Yeah, and Ramadan will also continue during this lockdown, unfortunately.
It's starting on Friday. I hope that people will stay indoors.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that in Israel, people don't know the problem of the Palestinians. You tell me that you try to have contact and to tell the stories, and that's very important. But I was with Broederlijk Delen Palestina in Palestina, and we met also other groups of Jews, and they weren't interested in what was happening 40 kilometers farther away after the wall. Aren't there other groups? Parent Circle does it, but aren't there other groups who try to explain the problem so that more people can understand what is happening?
You already told us that many Israelis don't know the stories of the Palestinians, and many Palestinians, I'm sure, they don't know the stories of the Israelis. Because it's a question that goes both ways. And the question is like, why is that? Why do you think that both groups are so unaware of each other's stories? I think that's the essence of Maria's question, actually.
But that's the nature of human beings, by the way. I mean, I've been to Belgium. I went to the quarter where most of the violence happened in Belgium. I can't remember, it's something with an L. I went in Brussels and spoke to them, and so the nature of people is to make like a clan of themselves. But also Israel and Palestine are completely cut off. There's a wall. I think you noticed it. And so that's why I said, if I go into a home of Palestinian women in the West Bank, they've never met an Israeli that's not a settler or a soldier. And if you go into the schools, it's the same story as I'm telling you, is you come into an Israeli school and they've never met a Palestinian. So when you don't know people, you fear them. And when you fear, you hate. And when you hate, you become violent. And this is the thing that wherever we can, we try to stop this. There is a difficult time in Israel now. I can't remember a more violent period, not violent physically, but violent in words. And that's very scary. So I don't know where we're going, but I know one thing, that we can't give up. Whatever happens, we will continue. And, you know, many people, it's like taking water out of the sea with a teaspoon, but we can't stop. And it's so important that you will take this message, that you saw these people who are completely involved in a different, non-violent reconciliation mode. Forgiving is another story. That's a very personal thing. But talking about reconciliation and trying to show that there's another way and push the ceremony to as many people as you can. It's terribly important that people see another voice coming out of here. Otherwise, they will lose hope.
So now I'm very curious how your people and co-workers and everybody, how do you make people talk? Because some of their experience are so difficult to talk about. And
you know, when firstly, I want to talk at some point, if we've still got time, about restorative justice. But when the Palestinian women first come to the parent circle, very hard for them, because they've never had the opportunity to tell their stories. So it could be the very first time that they actually tell their story. So what happens is you get a completely graphic detail of what happened, like how far the bullet was, how much blood there was, how the whole description of the death. But if you allow people, and they have to feel safe in the room, and very often because we are bereaved, they feel safe to talk. I'll tell you about Sri Lanka. I was in Sri Lanka. But so the more they tell their story, and even if it's the graphic details of how the person died, eventually they start to talk about the person that died. And that is the next level of healing. And I was in Sri Lanka now doing workshops, and it was so extraordinary. There was this woman sitting next to me. It was a lot of families who didn't know what happened to their children. But I could see she was dying to tell me something because I told my story. And I asked her what, and I gave her like half an hour of the whole, you know, the hour's workshop. And she said that she started to tell the story of how she lost her husband and her son. And it was the first time she'd ever told the story because she felt safe. And so what I'm really telling you, in other words, is that that person in the room has to feel very safe before they will tell you. And the next day when I came to have breakfast, her whole face was like glowing because she had an opportunity. But you can only do this if other people, you know, the first person that shares in a workshop usually sets the tone. It's very difficult though, because it's not the same culture. Israelis and Palestinians are big sharers, you know. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, you know, it changes all over the world. And the Sri Lankans were very laid back in the beginning. First, I could not remember anybody's name. So I had to translate all the names into English and give them name tags. So there was education and love and son of Rama and all of that. And that was the icebreaker. You have to find things to make people laugh also. Mm-hmm. I was actually more angry with the army, in many ways, because he should not have been there where he was killed. And the reports that they gave, it's a very long story. I don't want to go into this whole story now, but I didn't actually.
But maybe just go into a personal level. How did you manage, like, because at one point you managed, you decided to write this letter.
I was never ever angry because there wasn't a face to be angry with. I had no idea. I was angry with the army. I was angry that David was serving in the occupied territories. I was angry with myself that maybe I could have persuaded him not to go. But I, as a mother, I don't think anything worse ever happened to me. It doesn't go away. It stays with you every day. And, you know, but you make this decision. I didn't want to die with my child. I wanted to prevent other mothers from experiencing this because it's so, you learn to, it's what I said in the letter right in the beginning, you learn to live with it next to you, but it doesn't go away. There's a hole and it's there forever.